Yes, hello again, and another warm welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. Yes, thanks for returning to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and we're currently at the start of another racing year here in 2025, and we're just waiting on the new season getting underway with regards to classic racing. But we do have some nice events lined up for you this year, and we'll be bringing you all of the bikes and the track action from those events as they occur throughout the year. So next up, we're going to take a look at some nice Spanish Bultaco machines, and many of these bikes here are some of the bikes that I've picked up during my recent visits to the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, which of course will be coming up on the 8th and 9th of February in 2025. So let's dive straight into that video now and take a look at some of these beautiful looking Spanish Bultacos. Yes, hello again, and thanks for coming back to my YouTube channel. And as I mentioned in my last video posting, we're now basically on the countdown to our annual visit to the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, which will be coming up at the start of February. And just to get us all in an upbeat mood for the show, in this video here, we're going to take a look at some very nice Bultacos that I've come across during my last few visits to Telford. But we're not going to feature any particular model of Bultaco, but we're just going to try and pick out a few examples of Trials and Scrambles machines. And so to kick us off straight away, we have this nice Mark 11 250 Bultaco Pursang scrambler. And with regards the bike's actual year of manufacture, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's possibly maybe a 1978 or maybe even a 1979 bike, and as I believe a quite rare model as well. And it's certainly one of the first Mark 11 250 Pursangs that I've come across in quite some time. But according to this information plate that was placed alongside the bike, this is indeed, as I said, a Mark 11 Pursang model 206, which it said was an American prototype with the frame number 206-00001, which I'm assuming was the very first of its kind built by Bultaco. Although this bike's connection with Harry Everts, I can only assume that it was some kind of prototype that Bultaco built for him, because I do remember that Harry Everts did sign a 2-year deal to ride for Bultaco in 1977 and 78. So who knows, this may even be an ex-Harry Everts machine, but as I said, I don't know for sure. Anyhow, as you can see, it's still a cracking looking bit of kit, and it looks for all the world an original bike with that black engine that a lot of these later Pursangs were painted in, unlike of course the earlier bikes that were more renowned for their highly polished alloy engine casings. And if my memory is still working as it should, I remember that these Mark 11s, and I think it was the Mark 12s as well, were among some of the first Bultaco Pursangs to have this kind of over the engine high level exhaust system. And I think one of the other new features on these Bultacos was a reed valve block on the inlet side of the cylinder, just instead of the older piston port configuration. But as you can see, it was quite a substantial expansion chamber that was fitted to these Mark 11s, and this one here It certainly looks correct for its year, and also up here at the back of the exhaust, it was just a simple mild steel tailpipe that had removable baffles so that you could take out the old exhaust packing and then substitute it for new material. And up here at the front of our Bultaco, it was a set of beater forks at the front, and usually for the twin shocks at the rear, it was also a pair of those beater units. But as I said, it's a cracking looking bike with that connection to Harry Everts, although as I said, as to what the actual connection was, I don't actually know, because I never had a chance to speak to the owner on the day that I grabbed these short clips. Although this was another Mark 11 that was on display beside our 250, and I think this is another 78 or possibly a 79 bike, which is obviously another Mark 11, but this time it's one of those rarer 125s, which I unfortunately only managed to grab a few photos of, because the hall where these Bultacos were on display was quite compact and very busy with punters looking at the bike, so it was a bit of a smash and grab session just to try and get a couple of quick shots before more off-road Telford bike browsers walked into the shot. But once again, you can see that this is another Bultaco gem from the 1970s, and whether this bike is still in its original patina from that decade, I don't know, but I suspect that it's had a full restoration at one time, and I must say that the person who've done all the work on this bike's made a superb job of its refurbishment, because it looks better than any Bultaco that I'd ever seen sitting in a shop window dealership way back in the day. And in terms of these 125's rarity, I must say that this is one of the first Mark 11 125s that I've come across in a very long time, and I can't even remember even seeing any of these 125s on the track in the late 1970s, but it would have been quite nice to have been able to pull this bike out so that we could get a really good look at it, and not just from this right hand side. And as in our other Mark 11 250, this one here again appears to have undergone a total transformation, which appears to still have all of its bits and pieces that Bultaco bolted onto this 125 in its year of manufacture. But as I mentioned, I never actually spoke to the owner of both of these Mark 11s on the day of the show, so I can't really furnish you with any more information on both of the bikes, but it's suffice to say that they're a couple of little beauties, and in their way quite typical of the kind of quality machines that you see at Telford each year. Right, so next up, it's the first Trials Bultaco that we're going to take a look at, and this exquisite example is a 1975 M151 325cc Sammy Miller Highboy Trials bike, and for me personally, I think this was one of the nicest Trials bikes that I came across on the day of the show, which I have to say there were many. But in contrast to our previous two bikes, you can see straight away just how much room we have here to move around the bike, which is because I managed to sneak myself into the Telford halls on the Friday afternoon prior to the show starting on the Saturday, and it was a perfect opportunity to film some of the machines while the owners were beginning to set them up. So as I said, this is a 1975 325cc Bultaco, because it says it here on this front number plate, which of course helps me considerably, because as you know, Trials bikes aren't really my bag, and I know absolutely nothing about their intricacies or their functions, other than I know that Trials riding's a game of skill and balance, and it's far too complicated for a mere vintage dirt bike mortal as myself to try and understand. Although having said that, after a little bit of internet surfing, I did learn that the chassis on this Bultaco model was designed and developed by Trials legend, the great Sammy Miller, who of course called it his high boy because it had, I think it was about 12 inches of clearance underneath the engine, and the frame was also bronze welded, and they do say it had things like silent block bushes on that rear swing arm and the chain oiler that was built into the swing arm, which was much like the old Greeves bikes of the 1960s. Now feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here, but I suspect that this 325 piston port two-stroke engine was much the same power plant that Bultaco used on their Pursang Scrambles bikes, although I expect that these Trials engines may have had different types of gearing to what was used on the motocross versions. But I'll wager that a stock Bultaco engine was never this shiny in 1975 when it came from the factory, so I suspect that this bike here's never been used as an everyday trials bike, because I think it was possibly the most gleaming motorcycle that I'd come across over the entire 2 days of the show, and you can see that this owner's certainly put in a lot of effort to make her look her best on the big day. Now, also back in 1975, I'm pretty sure that this combined fuel tank and seat and side panel bodywork would have all been made from fiberglass back in that year, and I expect that this part again would have been a Sammy Miller product. And as you already know, I'm not exactly a trials bike person, but you just can't help admire the way that this bike's been turned out. And I'm not entirely sure if it actually won any prizes on the day of the show, although I must say if I was a judge, then this little Bulto would certainly have got top marks for presentation, because it's such a lovely example of one of these iconic Sammy Miller high boy trials bikes. And certainly on the day that I grabbed these clips and pictures, we did have quite a bit of time to get some good footage of this machine. And now that I've had a quick look at it again, I think that we've got more than enough video and pictures to do a full feature on this trials bike at a later date. But remember, and wear your sunglasses when you take a look at it again, so that you don't get blinded by all that super shiny chrome and polished alloy. But anyhow, next up we have a very brief look at another quite unusual Bultaco that I came across at Telford back in 2023, and it was this speedway bike that had a Bultaco engine in its chassis, which I thought was quite unusual, because normally it's a big single-cylinder four-stroker that you associate with powering these kind of bikes. But you can see straight away here that the engineering on this bike is super high quality, and this Bultaco engine is sitting inside an antique speedway chassis, who have been making these kind of grass track and speedway frames since about, I think it was about 1966 when they started. And as I remember, Antig also made chassis for those big Jap or John Alfred Prestwich four-stroke engines, which were very prominent speedway power plants in the 1960s and 1970s. But here we have again another superb specimen and quite unusual Bultaco powered bike, which I can only imagine would be great fun to ride when this particular antique Bultaco was to take to the track. Right, so our next Spanish Bultaco that we're going to take a look at is a superb looking specimen of a Bultaco Pursang motocrosser, which I think is a 1977 Mark 10 250 that I think was termed model number 192 in that year. And once more, this is another Spanish Bulto that's been through the full refurb process to make it look every bit as good as the day that it left the Spanish factory all those years ago. But inside this Pursang's steel tubular chassis, you had this much more traditional style piston port Bultaco two-stroke engine with its highly polished engine casings, which is, as I said, exactly how these bikes were delivered from the factory in that year. But I do remember these Mark 10s when they were racing on the track, and this engine here was without doubt reasonably powerful for a smaller 250. Now here at the front of these Pursangs, it was normally a pair of Spanish beater forks that was bolted onto the front, and it was just simple old school drum brakes that provided the stopping power here at the front, and of course at the back of the bike as well. Now the up and down movement at the back was controlled by again a pair of Beator piggyback suspension units, which to be fair for 1977 were pretty high tech as suspension systems go. But certainly the bike's chassis and this swing arm here were made from steel, and it did quite a good job of keeping the bike tracking straight and true. But as far as I'm aware, these Pursang fuel tanks were still being manufactured in fiberglass back in 1977, and this one here is in fantastic condition, even although it's probably been restored when the rest of this bike was refurbished. So you can see that a lot of these exhibitors that showcase their bikes at the Telford show each year certainly do take great pride in the way that their bikes look when they put them on display in the halls. And this 77 250 Bultaco Pursang is once again absolutely immaculate, and it looks even better than it did when it was brand new. So you just have to give the bike's owners top marks for all of their efforts and their presentations. And as I mentioned earlier, these examples here are very typical of the kind of high quality machines that you'll find at this classic dirt bike show each and every year. Right, so coming up next we have another interesting Trials Bultaco to take a look at, and this time round it's the turn of the 1975 World Trials champion Martin Lampkin's winning machine. And this feature bike here is the very machine that Martin won that world title on in that particular year. And Martin also is still regarded as the very first World Trials champion, because it was in 1975 that the European Trials Championship was then upgraded to world status. So Martin still has that title of the world's first ever Trials winner, courtesy of its upgrade status in 75. And so, as you can imagine, it was quite an achievement for Martin to take that world title riding a Spanish Bultaco, and it's because of his brand new world championship title that he achieved almost legendary status among Bultaco lovers across the globe. Now, I don't have any particulars about some of the parts that are bolted onto Martin's Sherpa T Trials bike, but I'm sure that some of you Trials and Martin Lampkin fans out there will know exactly what you're looking at here. And as far as I can make out, his bike is still in exactly the same original condition as it was when he took that coveted title back in 75. So not only have we got an iconic and world championship winning motorcycle on display, we've also got the history that accompanies it as well. And not only that, Martin, of course, is the father of that other British trials legend and 12 times world champion Dougie Lampkin, who has without doubt followed in his father's very successful footsteps. So it's quite a rare thing to have a father and a son being world champions in the same sport, but Martin had that accolade of being the world's first. So there you have it, yet another classic and original piece of motorcycle trials history. Martin Lampkin's 1975 Bultaco Sherpa T trials bike. Just one of the many historic off-road dirt bikes that I came across at Telford back in 22. Right, so this next bike that we're going to feature, I'm pretty sure is a 1982 Sherpa T model number 199B, according to my homework and internet surfing information, which I'm also led to believe was said to be one of the last models of Sherpa Ts that Bultaco made. But of course, if that information is not correct, then feel free to update that information in the comments section below your YouTube player. So once again, you can see that this is another beautifully turned out classic from the early 1980s, and more than likely a machine that's used purely as a show bike and not one of those everyday weekend racers. Now, the engine in our Bultaco Sherpa T is a 350 two-stroke, which I think had a 5-speed gearbox and the usual wet, oil-cooled multi-plate clutch. And as far as its power output went, this motor here was said to develop around the 21 horsepower bracket. So for a 350, it wasn't a massive amount of power, but then again, horsepower wasn't just so as important on one of these trials bikes in the early 1980s. Although I must say that during this 2023 classic dirt bike show at Telford, and in fact 2024 as well, there were so many very high quality and rare trials bikes at the show, and it was quite hard to know where to point the camera next because there was just so many great bikes to take a look at. And this vintage 82 Sherpa T was another example that was listed in that great looking bikes category. But as you can gather, it doesn't matter if you're into your old vintage scramblers, speedway, or even trials bikes, because there's always something to catch your eye at the show. Now, anyhow, this was another Bultaco classic that I spotted at Telford in 2023, and this little beauty here is a 1966 Mark I 250 Pursang, which I think was designated model number 11. Now, this particular bike here always seems to be mistaken for a Rickman Matisse Bultaco because, as you can see, they do look quite similar in their design and their overall looks, but there were a few subtle differences between the two. So firstly, the frame on this Bultaco was made from mild steel and not the 531 Reynolds steel tubing that was used on the Rickman chassis, and this frame's also been painted, whereby the Rickman frames were all usually nickel plated. But there were a couple of other differences between this Bultaco and the Rickmans. with the fuel tank on this Mark 1 having its fuel taps on the back of the tank and not at the front, as per the Rickman chassis. But at first glance, and maybe to the untrained eye, you'd more than likely have this bike labelled as a classic Rickman Bultaco the first time you set eyes on it. But of course, that was until you actually checked out the small print to prove otherwise. Now, engine-wise, it's said that there were a couple of variations to the engine that was fitted into these Mark 1s. Now, one power plant had a radial fin cylinder head, while the other had just a straight fin head, which was, of course, for the Scrambles bike, which is what we have here on our particular 250. But this was a great little 4-speed engine that was fueled through an old school Amal monoblock carburetor, and it was a reasonably compact and powerful little unit. So here at the front of our 250 Bultaco, I'm pretty sure that I'm right in saying that the forks that are fitted to these bikes weren't the normal beaters that a lot of these Spanish Bultaco bikes had back in the days. I'm sure that these are a pair of Italian Serianis that are fitted on this particular model, because as you're aware, Seriani did supply suspension systems to loads of different motorcycle manufacturers across Europe during the 1960s and 1970s. Although when it comes to this bike's rear suspension, I'm not just as sure, and I don't think these are still the original shocks that this bike came with in 1966, because they do look like they're maybe from a much later date than that. But my guess is that these are just a pair of reproduction classic shocks that have slightly more modern parts inside them, but made to look period correct for their time. And some of the other parts, like the bike's seat and fiberglass bodywork, are very similar to the Rickman bikes of their day. And this yellow colour scheme is said to be significantly lighter than the Rickman yellow. And again, here at the back of the bike, it was just a simple tubular steel type swing arm with those old school shoe and drum brakes at the rear. But when you look at the engineering and the overall condition of this little Bultaco, I'll wager once again that this is yet another fully blown show bike and not something that you'd want to hammer around a muddy, rough racetrack every other weekend. But you can see that the owners certainly spent a lot of time and probably money as well getting this old classic into this kind of condition, and more or less every single part of this machine is as it should be for one of these vintage Mark 1 250 Bultacos. Anyhow, after a little bit of research, I did find out that there were a total of 666 of these Mark 1s built, and our featured example here is number 479 off the Bultaco production line. And our 250 also is said to have all of its original matching engine and chassis numbers. So as you can gather, this little beauty is 100% authentic in almost every detail. But maybe if you're attending your next vintage or even classic scramble event, then the chances are that you're not going to be able to see this Bultaco lining up at the start line. But then again, some of these older classics do need to be saved for their historic value alone, so that future dirt bike enthusiasts can see exactly what kind of bikes excited us all those years ago. Right now, the old school classic theme continues as we get into our next video, when we'll be taking an in-depth look at this old timer here, which is a 1965 250 Greeves Challenger, another one of those great British classics from the golden era of the days when Britain had some of the best off-road riders and bikes on the planet. So make sure that you either subscribe or at the very least return to my channel to take a look at this wonderful old vintage classic.